Hey everyone, just before I start the episode, while I was editing and re-listening to the podcast, I realized that I had only kind of briefly touched on these things and not said it explicitly and clearly up front, so I wanted to make sure I do it here. In this episode, I talk a lot about empathy and communication and what those mean. Oftentimes in this discourse, empathy and communication are used interchangeably, and that's for a reason. Unfortunately, when most people use the term empathy, they use they usually use it to be interchangeable with words like compassion, or like a lack of empathy is usually used to indicate a morally bad person or a person who's lacking compassion, or a antisocial person who does bad things or treats people poorly. And I want to make it very clear that that is not the sense in which the term empathy is being used during this episode. When I say empathy, I'm talking about a very specific thing. I'm not talking about compassion, and I'm not talking about morality. Empathy in this episode is being used how cognitive scientists talk about empathy. And when they talk about empathy, they typically use two categories, and these two categories are what are called affective or effective empathy. Another term for it is emotional and cognitive empathy. Affective or emotional empathy refers to the cognitive ability to spontaneously and intuitively share in another person's emotions, understand what's going on in their head, sort of like mind read, where you spontaneously and intuitively know what's going on because you have the ability to read body language and interpret nonverbal communication. Cognitive empathy, or effective empathy, refers to your ability to reason things and figure out what a person is thinking through basically just thinking about what they are probably thinking, given all these other effects. When autism researchers say autistic people have a lack of empathy, they're talking about deficits in affective empathy, not effective empathy. Having a deficit in affective empathy does not mean you lack compassion. It does not mean you lack morality. It does not indicate anything morally bad about you. It doesn't correlate at all with being a better or worse person. It doesn't correlate at all with being more moral or less moral. Autistic people, in general, are very compassionate, very concerned with doing the right thing. Often, autistic people really care about doing the right thing. They really care about justice. They really care about making sure that things are in line with their morality and with their principles, and are usually extremely concerned with doing the right thing. Now, what the right thing is will depend on your morality and your principles, but in general, autistic people are very moral creatures. We care a lot about doing things in alignment with our moral code, and we often find infractions against that moral code as unconscionable. We are not less moral. We are not less compassionate. We don't feel things less. We aren't bad people. That's not what a lack of affective empathy is saying, or a lack of emotional empathy. A lack of emotional empathy is just saying that cognitively you tend not to experience a lot of and intuitive understanding of people's emotions, what's going on inside of their head, and the ability to sort of figure out what's happening through nonverbal contextual clues. Again, most of us are very principled. We care a lot about whether we hurt people, or we care about not being an active source of harm, and actively care about what's going on. We don't like upsetting people. We don't like frustrating people in general. I mean, there are some just bad people who have autism out there, but in general, that is not the case for the vast majority of autistic people. In fact, it has been shown many, many times that autistic people are far more likely to stick to our moral principles, even if we know someone's not watching, or even if it will come at a great personal cost to us. A lack of empathy, I want to make clear, if autistic people do in fact have a lack of empathy, and again, I'm not saying they do, But if they do, that does not impute any meaning to whether or not they're compassionate, whether or not they are morally good or act in accordance with their principles. Throughout the podcast, I also talk about the double empathy problem, and I interchangeably use empathy and communication. And I realize that might be confusing for some people, so I just wanted to clarify. The double empathy problem doesn't just refer to empathy, it refers to communication and communication more broadly in the way that it's talked about. The reason that it's so closely tied to communication is affective empathy is heavily used to mediate most of our social interactions in society. When we think about how people socialize and how people socially interact, affective empathy is heavily used. And so affective empathy is often used as a way of talking about socialization and social communication, because this ability to spontaneously share in another person's emotions, understand what's going on, socially mirror a person, mind read, and spontaneously attribute thoughts and ideas to someone based on nonverbal communication is what makes up a lot of normative human communication in the vast majority of human societies, including the ones that we currently are living in. So that's why I tend to talk about the double empathy problem and then talk about communication deficits. Communication deficits are sort of hand in hand with affective empathy deficits. But in case it wasn't clear during the podcast, I think I clarified, but in case it wasn't, I just want to make those caveats up front. Anyway, I just wanted to make that clear before the podcast starts, just so we're all on the same page and we know what I'm actually trying to say when I say these things. Okay, cool. Now start the podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum. This podcast is the summation of about 10 years of research covering around 26,000 Christian and ex-Christian autistics and investigates the intersection of autism and Christianity. Last episode, I talked about issues with the medical model of disability and the social model of disability, and why we shouldn't think of this as an either or situation, but a both and situation. I mostly talked about why the social model of autism is useful and applicable, but should be more nuanced. And that we shouldn't be saying the medical model is bad and we should ditch it. We should instead say that the social model is useful for answering some questions and the medical model is useful for answering different questions. Both of these models are useful, and both of these models work for very different reasons. And I wanted to do a deeper dive into a specific example of why I think we need to nuance these models in a common talking point that you will now see a lot in autistic activist spaces, which is the double empathy problem. So, before I get into the double empathy problem, I should probably try to explain the sort of dominant view of autism that you get, especially when it comes to questions of empathy and communication. If you look in the DSM, or if you ask the majority of autism researchers, neuroscientists, these types of people, and you ask them about autistic people, they will typically say something like, autistic people have communication deficits. They have empathy deficits, they have mind blindness, or they have theory of mind and mentalizing deficits. I could get into what all of those mean, but the sort of TLDR of all these different ideas is that most people have a normal range of certain cognitive capacities that correlate to social communication ability and the ability to understand and empathize with other people and model their mental states. Autistic people have subnormal cognitive capabilities in this specific area, and autistic people struggle with communication because they have subnormal cognitive capacities in these areas. If you go to the vast majority of autism research, that's what you're going to find. You're going to find explanations like that. In 2012, a guy named Damian Milton, who's an autistic sociologist, proposed an alternative explanation to the medical model and the sort of dominant epistemological paradigm that you find within autism research, explicitly invoking the social model. Damien wasn't trying to do like controlled scientific analysis or broad analysis of the data or map cognitive capacities or anything like that. What Damien was doing was looking at autism not as a set of capacities, but as a sociological phenomenon that rejects the framing of the scientific consensus about autistic communication deficits and asks, what if something different is going on? Milton wasn't doing like systematic reviews or meta-analyses of studies to try to find things that those studies weren't compensating for or anything like that. What he was instead doing was looking at the way that communication breakdown happens and empathy gaps get characterized by scientific research and asking, is this the right way to frame it? What if instead we looked at this from a sociological perspective instead of a cognitive deficit perspective? What if autistic people don't actually have these cognitive deficits? What if the real issue is that society just assumes we have cognitive deficits because we have a different communication style? And instead of recognizing this unique communication style or this unique way of processing information, we have labeled that uniqueness a deficit instead of just saying a difference. In his paper, Milton says the following for defining the double empathy problem. He says, the double empathy problem, a disjuncture in reciprocity between two different disposed social actors, which becomes more marked and wider the disjuncture in dispositional perceptions of the life world. Perceived as a breach in the natural attitude of what constitutes social reality for neurotypical people, and yet an everyday and often traumatic experience for autistic people. Now, if you can't parse that sentence, that's fine. It is written in fairly dense sociological academic prose, so I'll break this down, and I'll just break down what he's trying to get across in that paper in the most accurate way that I can, in plain language. The double empathy problem suggests that autistic people don't have an empathy deficit. We do not have a cognitive capacity that limits our empathy, but the reason that autistic people struggle with empathizing is better understood as a sociological phenomenon. Because empathy, and empathy in this case doesn't mean feeling bad for someone, it means being able to take their perspective and being able to understand the world through their eyes. Because empathy is tied to social communication and the experience of socialization and social communication, these things will ultimately affect the way that autistic people communicate. So the double empathy problem isn't just about empathy, it's also about cognitive capacities related to communication. And it states that autistic people do struggle to empathize with non-autistic people, but non-autistic people also struggle to empathize with autistic people. However, this is only considered a problem for one of us. This is only considered a problem for the autistic people because non-autistic people live in a society in which their communication style is normal and expected, whereas the autistic communication style is abnormal and unexpected. And so this abnormality and unexpectedness is labeled a deficit when really it's actually a difference. And this is only considered a problem for autistic people and not for non-autistic people because of the social asymmetries involved in that, because of power dynamics that are different between the autistics and the non-autistics, and because of structural barriers that are imposed on autistic people from a neuronormative society that assumes everyone is neurotypical and does not assume that you're autistic. In this model, the deficits in the double empathy problem are actually in both places. Right? It isn't that autistic people have a deficit and non-autistic people don't. It's that both of us have deficits understanding the other. So autistic people don't have difficulties understanding other autistic people in the same way that non-autistic people don't have difficulties understanding other non-autistic people. However, when you cross those streams, that's when you get difficulties. But the difficulty isn't that we're lacking cognitive capacity. The difficulty is we are crossing streams of different communication styles. And you can see this in a different example. So let's say you take two people from two very different cultures. You take person A and put them in person B's culture. They have very different communication norms, they have very different socialization norms. Person A might make a lot of mistakes, might say a lot of things wrong, might not have a good native grasp of the language, may not be able to articulate themselves very well. Is it fair to say that person A actually has a communication deficit? Or do they just have a different communication style, different cultural norms, and different ways of thinking about things? And the only reason it's considered a deficit is because they're in culture B. And if you brought them back to their home country, they wouldn't have a communication deficit because everyone else is communicating like them. And the double empathy problem is asking, is this what's happening with autistic people? Are we basically just like culture A and culture B, whereas we are culture people from culture A implanted in culture B, and the reason that it seems like we have cognitive deficits, or the reason it seems like we have cognitive deficits, or the reason it seems like we have the inability to empathize or difficulties with communication, isn't because there's actually something wrong with us. It's because we're communicating, expecting like we're in culture A, when we're actually in culture B. And if you just brought us culture A, there wouldn't be any problems. And this is a really useful model. It's very powerful, and it is extremely useful to describe a lot of things. I've used the double empathy problem several times during this podcast because it is a very elegant way of describing how these social asymmetries exist, but not only how these social asymmetries exist, but how we as a society think of social asymmetries and how we often improperly pathologize experiences that shouldn't be pathologized and often called differences deficits when those differences aren't deficits. And I think that the double empathy problem is extremely useful. It is a very good and useful conceptual model. It is a model that has a broad range of applicability. It is a model that has a lot of explanatory power. And when I'm talking about why autistic people don't function in Christianity nearly as well as their non autistic counterparts, I'm using conceptual frameworks laid out by the mechanisms proposed in the double empathy problem. My fundamental suggestion throughout this podcast has been, if the church was more open to autistic ways of communicating and autistic ways of being, and more open to to autistic expression, then the chances that we would be less likely to be Christian would probably go down significantly. And I've often characterized the disjunctures that autistic people have with Christianity not as a problem with autistic people, but as a problem of the way that we do church and the barriers that we put in place of autistic people. And this is, I think, an accurate and proper characterization of what's going on. It's very helpful. And more importantly, it doesn't treat autistic people like they're sort of hopeless broken toys and permanently screwed. Like it is optimistic in many ways. The idea of the double empathy problem is that the problem is actually a cultural one, and it's one that we can fix. It's one that we can work on. And it also just helps reframe and restructure autistic social problems. Like, autistic people have social communication issues, for sure. I don't think anyone would deny that we have issues, that we feel lonely, that we get socially rejected, that we have all these problems. Even your most ardent user of the social model of disability would never deny that because it's simply obvious. But what the double empathy problem does is it points out, like, look, autistic people always have to try to accommodate non-autistic people because we, in order to exist in this society, we need to communicate on your terms. We need to be able to communicate in the way that you're used to being communicated to. And people aren't meeting us halfway. And I often think about two of my close friends who are not autistic. I went to military college with both of them. One of them was my lab partner, one of them was a history guy, and neither of them are autistic. But I get along great with them, and I've always gotten along great with them. And I think the reason that I've gotten along great with them is because they figured out pretty early on that I was a bit odd, that there was something a bit off, that I had an autism spectrum disorder, and they met me halfway. And they met me halfway in a way that a lot of other people simply haven't ever, and haven't really given me the chance. And a lot of the ways that I was able to just successfully socially integrate was because they gave me that grace. They met me in that 50-50 ground. And a lot of the problems pointed out by the double empathy problem is that most people just don't meet autistic people halfway. Communication is a two-way street, and their point is that a lot of non-autistic people basically say it's my way or the highway, and when autistic people can't get on the highway, they kick them to the curb. And yeah, it's a good theory. It is very good for explaining things like why autistic people like and prefer other autistic people. Like homophily clumping is something I talk about a lot, where autistic people tend to find each other, we tend to stick to each other, and we tend to become friends with each other much faster. Like, this is exactly what you would predict to happen if the double empathy problem is true, right? If autistic people don't actually have communication issues, but we just communicate differently, it would make sense that if you take that culture A, culture B analogy, that other people from culture A living in culture B would simply find other implants from culture A living in the culture B space and make friends with them. And it would probably be much easier for them to make friends. And the double empathy problem basically explains that really well. And why autistic communities form their communication norms that they form, and like a lot of really interesting phenomena about intersocial autistic communication development, and like why autistic people tend to not have communication problems with other autistic people, and why if you get a whole bunch of autistic people on like your computer engineering team, a lot of them can get on quite well with each other. And I think it's best summed up from Milton's 2012 paper, where he introduces the double empathy problem, where he says the empathy problem being a two-way street has been mentioned by both autistic writers and neurotypical writers alike. Yet, despite such protestations, the lack of theory of mind myth persists. And this is of course referring to like Simon Baron-Cohen's autism work, which suggests that autistic people have theory of mind deficits, or the inability to model other people's mental states. There are a lot of studies since Milton wrote his paper in 2012 that have looked into the double empathy problem, or thought about the double empathy problem, and used the double empathy problem as a conceptual framework. They show a lot of really important and really interesting things about autistic people, about the sociology of autism, and about autistic communication. They found a lot of things. Most of these things are things that most autistic people would already sort of like intuitively know, that it's like, really, you had to do a study on those. But I mean, it is good to do a study on them, so we're not just vibing our way through autism, and just like empirically verifying things is good. And so a lot of this has been empirical verification of stuff autistic people have known for years. Things like, in general, speaking is easier, or in general, communication and speaking to other autistic people is easier. In general, autistic people prefer other autistic people to be friends and company. Autistic people tend to be able to reliably and accurately relay information to each other. And in some cases, they can do it better than non-autistic people. Autistic people can relay information to other non-autistic people just fine. Autistic people tend to feel better and more socially comfortable in interactions with other autistic people, especially if they know that that other person is autistic. And autistic people can empathize, often very well, with other autistic study participants, and show high levels of rapport and connection, which you wouldn't expect if we had empathy deficits. And a lot of people who aren't autistic have trouble understanding autistic people, have trouble understanding autistic reasoning and ways of thinking. There have been some attempts to empirically verify the double empathy problem. I'll talk about two of those ways. The first one is a paper called Autistic Peer-to-Peer Information Transfer is Highly Effective, published 20 May 2020 by the University of Edinburgh. This is an attempt to validate the double empathy problem through testing information transfer between chains of homogeneous autistic groups, homogeneous non-autistic groups, and mixed autistic non-autistic groups. So what they did is they basically recruited a whole bunch of participants through the community, through social media, and through local autism organizations. And they went with the assumption that if autistic people truly do have communication deficits, then if you got a group of autistic people all together, they should be worse across the board at transferring information one to another than a group of non-autistic people. And so they talk about these as diffusion chains. They're basically playing a game of telephone. And they create different groups of autistic people. So they create different groups of autistic and non-autistic people. So they had a group of only autistic people, a group of only non-autistic people, and then a few variations of autistic person, non-autistic person, autistic person, non-autistic person in a chain. And the idea is that if autistic people do have communication deficits, the autistic to autistic communication should be a mess. And the mixed autistic to non-autistic communication should also be a mess because you have that communication gap. But the homogeneous group of non-autistic people should perform the best out of all of them because they don't have communication deficits. The task was basically they got a 30-point story about a bear on a surreal adventure, and they designed the experiment so that the story was difficult to predict and did not include any inherently social aspects and was at the sort of age 9 to 10 reading level to make up for that. They also arranged people in order of age so that like age related memory deficits didn't affect things. And they basically just played games of telephone, figuring out in different chains which ones were most and least affected in this communication. What they found seems to validate the double empathy problem. They found that homogeneous groups of autistic people were just as effective as homogeneous groups of non-autistic people when transferring information. There was no difference between these two groups that was meaningful or discernible. They also showed that mixed groups, so the chains of alternating autistic, non-autistic people, had the worst results out of all of the groups. They also showed that rapport wasn't really significantly different, but that autistic people preferred autistic people. Shocking, more news at 12. But so this study had some flaws, like, it had an N of 72. It was a all volunteer study, so there is probably some selection bias in that. And the people that did the study were the type of people who signed up for studies. And I can say, as one of the guys who like actively looked for and signed up for studies, you got to be kind of weird to do that. So maybe that's not representative of the autistic population. I don't know. I have hard troubles trying to fault them for small sample sizes and volunteer selection biases. Like, this is a useful result, right? This is a useful result that shows actually autistic people can relay information to each other just fine, and in fact do it as effectively as non-autistic adults. Another similar study came out just last month called Information Transfer Within and Between Autistic and Non-Autistic People. It came out 14th of May 2025, also by the University of Edinburgh. And it builds off that previous study that I had talked about. Basically, they did the same thing that they did with the last cohort, but they had a much higher participation numbers. They had 311 people, and they, instead of using one story, a sort of surreal story about a bear, they used a few different stories that were like fiction and nonfiction to see if there were any differences between these types of things. And again, rapport and like comfortability and things like that. By rapport, I probably should have defined that earlier. Rapport was measured in 5 dimensions. So these dimensions are ease, enjoyment, success, friendliness, and then negatively scoring awkwardness. And so they basically just asked the people to rate their interactions with the people that they were interacting with afterwards. And yeah, so they reproduced the study, just this time with a much larger sample set and with a um, a different variety of stories. And what they found was actually different this time. So this time running the study, whereas before they found that all autistic chains and non-autistic chains, when they're homogeneous, didn't have communication difficulties. In this study, they actually found that in mixed chains, there also weren't many difficulties. They explicitly say in their hypothesis, we hypothesize that information transfer would deteriorate faster and rapport would be lower in mixed neurotype compared to single neurotype chains. So this is building off the findings of the last study. Additionally, we examined whether informing participants of diagnostic status of their chain and whether information was fictional or factual impacted performance and rapport. And their findings were, we found no difference in information transfer between single neurotype and mixed neurotype chains. Non autistic chains indicated higher rapport, and disclosing diagnosis improved rapport. This result challenges assumptions about autistic communication deficits, but contrasts prior findings. And so after this, you might be like, wow, slam dunk. This seems like it is perfect theory that we should use and is totally right and everything like that. Because one, John, you just described how useful it is and how good it is at explaining certain social phenomena, and there are studies to prove it. And I wish that is where I could stop this podcast. I really do. Because I love the double empathy problem. I think it's really cool. But I'm also a researcher who cares about reality, and unfortunately, the story of the double empathy problem is a lot more complicated than that. The double empathy problem is a very useful model, and it explains a lot. However, the fundamental underlying premise of the double empathy problem is sort of flawed. The idea that it's not actually a deficit, it's society, is a comforting story, but it doesn't really account for, okay, but what if it actually is a deficit? What if it's both? What if autistic people do have communication deficits? And society also places abstract barriers on autistic people in the way we communicate. What if the double empathy problem doesn't challenge the myth of theory of mind deficits, as Milton suggested? What if it just describes sociological phenomena that result from theory of mind deficits? And so while the double empathy problem can describe real phenomena, it can also be true that autistic people have empathy deficits and that we have communication deficits. The double empathy problem, like in all the studies, doesn't really isolate autism and social contexts. It tests things in abstract cases in which lots of complex issues related to the sociological phenomena of communication simply aren't measured or being taken into effect. And the double empathy problem also doesn't clearly articulate how it's measuring empathy and communication. Like what are empathy and communication in the double empathy problem? And it really depends. Unfortunately, the way that the double empathy problem is used in autism research is a massive moving target, where the definition of communication becomes either so broad and so abstract that it becomes useless, or so narrow and so specific that it's no longer describing communication or it's no longer describing empathy, but is instead describing something else entirely. And then what do we do with the whole huge body of autism research that really does seem to suggest that there are theory of mind deficits in people who have autism. I've been a participant in these studies. I know for a fact I score really poorly on some of these empathy tests. And this isn't because I'm not an empathetic person. I think I am very compassionate. It's just I'm very bad at doing it spontaneously. I have to think about it for a while. One of the tests that I had to do was they basically put a whole bunch of things on my head. I and like put me in an fMRI machine, and I had two buttons that I had to press, and you had to answer whether or not these people had a negative disposition towards you or a positive disposition towards you. And they gave you 2 seconds to do it. I failed that test so hard. I didn't think I failed the test. I was like, wow, that was really hard, but I'm sure everyone finds that really hard. And after they were like, well, no, not really. You just scored really poorly, probably because you have autism. It's like, oh, okay. But they did other tests where they don't give you 2 seconds, they give you 5 seconds. And when you slow it down and give me 5 seconds, I score just right up with everyone else. So it's like, okay, my ability to spontaneously attribute is not nearly as good as everyone else's. But if you give me a few seconds, I can catch up. And like, what do you do with that with a double empathy problem? Where like you can point to a lot of these studies, a lot of cognitive science, a lot of neuroscience, and a lot of actual like good proper empirical research that sort of shows autistic people just do struggle doing these tasks that most people are really good at. I don't know. Like that seems like a problem to me with the double empathy problem because we're no longer talking about cultural difference at this point. We're talking about brain structures. And sure, I'm sure if you go to different cultures, you can find all sorts of anomalies because of the way that education works, the types of cognitive processes that they have to use in their social communication. I'm sure you can find all sorts of things like that. It's like maybe there is actually some underlying cognitive developmental issues. And like so we talked about those studies, right? Those studies that show autistic people don't struggle with communication. Look, we validated the double empathy problem, but I think you should read the methodologies of those studies quite closely. What were they doing? Was it communication? Or was it a contrived, simplistic example of controlled information transfer or like parroting? And sure, I will happily grant autistic people are probably pretty good at parroting social information. We're probably good at repeating things that we've heard being spoken from other people. Guess what? That is not what most social communication is. In fact, that is probably one of the easiest tasks in social communication. I have a 2 year old. My 2 year old parrots us. This is not an impressive skill. This is a really, really basic cognitive developmental milestone, being able to repeat information that someone else has told you. The vast majority of social communication that occurs is not parroting. It is expressing complex things about your own thoughts. A very, very common problem that a lot of autistic people talk about is the inability to articulate their own thoughts and feelings. And that's a huge part of communication. Also, just not being able to understand nonverbal communication. Do you realize that these studies didn't test your ability to communicate this information non-verbally? Maybe you missed something there. And it's like, are these studies bad? No, they're not bad. They show an important thing, which is that autistic people can successfully complete very simplistic social interactions with the same level of effectiveness as non autistic people. But do they show autistic people don't have communication deficits? Also, no. Like, they show we're good at parroting. That's not communication. I'm sorry. And like every articulation of the double empathy problem or other things will use sort of these really simplistic stripped back examples of a really complex social phenomena that is communication and not really account for that, and will instead talk about communication like it's simply I have information in my head and I need to get it into your head, so I'm going to say something. Like that isn't what communication is. It's not just information transfer. It's a complex discursive social phenomena, and one that autistic people tend to not be very good at participating in, even with other autistic people, unfortunately. And like the double empathy problem doesn't account for a lot of really important phenomena that you need to account for when you're talking to about autistic people. Does the double empathy problem account for the idea that autistic people may be using compensation strategies that just work very well with other autistic people, but not with non-autistic people? Have autistic people developed socialization algorithms and ways of being that work really well with other autistic people, but not with non autistic people? And so they do have empathy deficits, they do have communication deficits, but these empathy and communication deficit compensation mechanisms that they build just happen to work really well with other people who have built similar mechanisms. And so you can still have a deficit, but your compensation strategies just so happen to be super effective with this one subset of the population, and the subset are the other people who happen to have developed the same strategies. So it's like the double empathy problem can still apply, but it's very much not saying that you don't have a deficit. It's saying that because of your deficit you've developed a different culture of because of your deficit you have developed norms similar to a person in culture A, and that means that other people from culture A will be better able to communicate with you. It also doesn't account for social constraints and restraints that autistic people place on autistic communication to constrain and control conversation. So, one thing that a lot of these studies don't account for, and a lot of the double empathy problem doesn't account for, is that in autism spaces, one of the first things that we do is explicitly lay out social rules. And then when someone keeps violating a rule, we just create a new rule. One of the features of a lot of autistic communities is they have lots of rules that govern how you're supposed to talk, explicitly laid out. Like one of the things that I first implemented on my Discord is a rule that try to use tone indicators wherever you can, because autistic people are really bad at reading social context and will often miss when someone's joking. And so instead, I impose a rule that says after you write a joke in text, put /J at the end so everyone else knows that that was intended to be a joke. And most people can figure that out. Most people can figure that out pretty well. Autistic people pretty consistently don't, and pretty consistently can't. And so, because we don't and because we can't, we apply these like artificial constraints and restraints on our conversations and on our social settings. And so when you meet other autistic people, we also have just rules that we agree to abide by. And whether we develop these explicitly or whether we develop these implicitly is another question. But if you go to spaces that are heavily autistic, you will notice that they develop very different norms around communication that are built explicitly to compensate for the fact that a lot of people don't understand sarcasm. Now, is that just a different culture, or is that we recognize that some of us have communication deficits that stop us from being able to understand subtleties in nonverbal communication? So we're going to say, don't use that form of nonverbal communication, or explicitly indicate that you are using it through some other mechanism. To me, that indicates a deficit. To me, that indicates a deficit, and you're imposing something, you're artificially imposing a constraint to compensate for deficit. Another really big problem with a lot of double empathy problem analysis is that it doesn't account for the fact that autistic communities are formed through survivorship and selection, meaning that most autistic people get into communities of other autistic people who are like them, and if they're not like them, they quickly leave them. And this forms an effect where basically autistic people quickly filter into a community, and then if they don't fit, quickly filter out. And so the only people who stay in those communities are people who can follow and abide by those social norms of those communities. So my frequent joke for the podcast is the problem with disability, or the problem with autism activism, is it's filled with the type of people who want to do autism activism. Like that is explaining this, that the people doing autism activism are the types of people who have the social predisposition to want to do these things. And that often leads them to thinking that other autistic people are just like them. And that isn't true. Something I talk about a lot is what I call competing autisms, where autistic people are different from each other. And autism is a heterogeneous condition. And a lot of times, those differences cause genuine problems between autistic people where they simply can't communicate with each other, they can't empathize with each other, and they can't understand each other. It is incredibly common to have competing autisms. And it's like, this shouldn't be happening under the double empathy problem. Now, sure, not all non autistic people like other non autistic people. Like, within groups, lots of people hate each other. I'm not saying that all autistic people need to be friends, or that the double empathy problem predicts that all autistic people will be friends with each other and understand each other. I'm saying that these autistic people straight up cannot mentally model the other autistic person and cannot understand what's going on in their heads. Something I talk about a lot is there are a lot of trans autistics, but there are also a lot of TERF autistics. And trying to navigate the trans autism and the TERF autism, these are very, very different groups who think very, very differently, who are fundamentally unable to understand the other group and why they think the way they do. Now, I will say, some autistic people are excellent at empathizing and mentally modeling. At this point in my life, I am really good at understanding all sorts of autistic people, but that's because I spend all my free time doing that. However, on balance, autistic people are really good at understanding other autistic people like them, who are from similar backgrounds, who have similar training and similar life experiences. That's the thing. It isn't autistic people and all autistic people. It's just that most autistic people, the other autistic people they know, are the people who have gone through the same selection filters to be in the places that they are. And one thing that I will bring up is a very, very frequent story that I hear from late diagnosed autistic adults, is that they look back on their life and they think about people who they struggled with the most. And a lot of those times they look back and think, oh, I was struggling because that person had autism. And I also had autism. And we just didn't realize that was what was going on. That's not something you should expect to happen under the double empathy problem. That would be something you would expect under like a empathizing deficit or a theory of mind deficit. There's another effect that I have called the 5% effect, and this comes from a meme. So to explain the meme, there is a picture, a famous picture of the Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels, and he is glaring at a cameraman. And the backstory behind that picture is that he had just learned that the person taking the photo was Jewish and was obviously not very enthusiastic about that. And there's a meme that goes around autistic communities every so often that is that picture, and overlaid is the text, autistic people when they find someone 5% more autistic than them. And that's a real thing. Autistic people like other autistic people until they meet someone who is more autistic than them. And a lot of times they have very visceral reactions to these people, like very negative reactions when people present more autistically than they do, because they're like, you're embarrassing us. You're making our lives worse. Autistic people can be incredibly vicious and incredibly autistic people can be incredibly vicious, incredibly pernicious, unempathetic, and ununderstanding when someone is also autistic but visibly showing more signs and symptoms of autism. Auti- Autism and autistic communities aren't always a hug box for autistic people. They are oftentimes very ruthless and very brutal. That's not what you would expect. Under the double empathy problem, you wouldn't expect there to be a meme that people find very relatable and frequently share of Joseph Goebbels glaring at a cameraman and then saying autistic people when they find another autistic person who's 5% more autistic than them. It does present a very serious challenge to the conceptual model of the double empathy problem. And finally, and I think this is the biggest problem that the double empathy problem does not account for, the double empathy problem only describes people with ASD1 and only describes a very few select people with ASD1. Like, it only describes the sort of top performing, high achieving super autists. And by super autists, I don't mean the most autistic, I mean high performing, high achieving autistic people. If you look at people with ASD2 or ASD3 and say these people don't have communication deficits, most people will look at you very confused. Because a lot of people with ASD2 and ASD3 literally cannot speak. They literally cannot articulate. And if they can, they often do it very poorly. They are not very articulate. I've spoken to many of them. I have spent lots of time talking to lots of them. I'm sorry, these people have communication deficits. Obviously so. And it takes a certain type of cruelty to deny that they don't, and to say they don't actually have this problem that they very obviously do. They literally cannot talk. I don't know why you wouldn't consider that a communication deficit. And the ones who can talk are not hyperlexic like a lot of people with ASD1 are. They are the exact opposite. And the thing is, ASD1 is related to ASD2 and ASD3. Now, I'll be very clear, ASD1 is very different in presentation than ASD2 and ASD3. There's a reason we have 1, 2, and 3 as separate labels and separate categories. However, a lot of people with ASD1 can see and feel the symptoms that they're seeing and feeling, and then see people with ASD2 and ASD3 and recognize their own feelings in those people's behavior. A lot of people who have ASD2 become people with ASD1. What's the difference between them? They basically just, their negative symptoms improved. That's what happened. People with ASD2 become an ASD, or people with ASD3 become ASD2. The autism spectrum is a spectrum, and all of us are on it. And even though ASD1 is very different from ASD2, which is very different from ASD3, there are long continuous traits that span across us in intensity and severity and frequency. Like, even though ASD1, ASD2, and ASD3 are different things and present very differently from each other, there are traceable continuous trends across ASD1, 2, and 3. People with ASD2 and ASD3 very clearly have obvious communication deficits. Just straight up on its face, they do. I don't understand why a person with ASD2 and ASD3 would have a communication deficit, but all of a sudden when you get to ASD1, we don't have a deficit anymore. That doesn't make sense. It makes more sense that these versions of autism have communication deficits and that ASD1 also has communication deficits. The deficits are just less severe and less pronounced, or in different ways. And I think, like, that's sort of a really big problem that the double empathy problem needs to reckon with. Why is it that people with ASD2 and ASD3 have communication deficits? Like, that last paper that I talked about, there was a press release for it. Let me read this press release for you because I personally found it funny. I tweeted out when it was released, "Look at my autism researcher's dog. We're never going to make it." Because the study says autistic people communicate just as effectively as others, study suggests. And it's like, really? Have you met an autistic person with ASD2 or ASD3? Are you seriously going to sit there and tell me that we don't have communication deficits when a guy can't talk? Like, obviously, this study is only talking about people with ASD1, and likely, because it's being run out of a university, is probably pulling from other university participants, because that's just the nature of university studies. But the suggestion, might I say, the audacity of these people to say with a straight face, autistic people don't have communication deficits, study suggests. It's just like, what are you talking about? Change that to some people with ASD1, and sure, I'll gladly grant some people with ASD1 can communicate just as effectively as others. I think I'm in that category. I think I can, at this point in my life, effectively communicate with people. This was not the case for most of my life, though. I would say up until fairly recently in my adult life, I have had constant, persistent communication deficits. I still have communication issues, but at this point in my life, I've managed to sort through that and figure it out to the point where I feel like I don't have communication issues at any higher severity than like my non-autistic coworkers. That's also just because a lot of people in my life are very accommodating of me. But anyway, all this is to say, hey guys, why do ASD2 and 3 people have communication deficits, but ASD1 people all of a sudden magically don't? Maybe something else is going on here. And another question that comes up is the double empathy problem based on good data? Was this taking a whole bunch of studies, looking at them, finding that actually autistic theory of mind methodology testing in these studies is insufficient? And there are lots of things that you can point out that show that this isn't actually what it's supposed to do. And like, is it a critique of these studies? Is it a systematic review of autism literature? Is it a meta-analysis of existing literature on autistic cognitive deficits? Or is it sort of vibes? And like, this is a good question. And there's a 2022 paper called The Double Empathy Problem 10 Years Later that's by Milton and a few others. And it straight up says, Whistle, the theorizing behind the concept of the double empathy problem was initially derived through a combination of personal experience, anecdotal accounts, and limited qualitative data. This area of concern has been approached by numerous research projects, particularly within the field of psychology, but also more broadly to disciplines of neuroscience. I want to just break that down a little bit. How was the double empathy problem built and validated? He had a hunch. He had a hunch and a bunch of anecdotes and limited qualitative data and just asserted this. And now we are trying to prove that's an effect. That is a very cool thing to do within the scientific method is making an observation and then creating a hypothesis. Great. I am totally cool with hunches. However, This hunch really isn't data informed. It's not data informed today either. The papers that try to show it aren't actually showing the effect proposed by the double empathy problem. They are showing other things. Like the two studies that we talked about both indicate or both explicitly call out the double empathy problem and how this is like a validation of the double empathy problem. It straight up isn't. I'm sorry. This is not the double empathy problem. This is something else. This isn't data informed. This is basically vibes based speculation, which is something I'm really cool with, but like, let's make sure it stays in the realm of vibes based speculation. And let's think about things more deeply. Let's ask ourselves, what is communication? Is communication simply just information transfer? And no, it's not. Communication is more than just getting thoughts from point A to point B. It's a complex social ritual that isn't just for transferring information. That's one factor in communication. Communication is about participating in this discursive community ritual that involves emotional expression and emotional interpretation. It's about assuaging people's feelings or inflaming them. It's about a whole lot of different type of nonverbal communication. It's about vibes. It's about following rules. It's about etiquette and expectations. It's about anticipating other people's needs and feelings. It's about managing other people's feelings and compensating for their experiences and making exceptions, knowing when to make exceptions, knowing when the mood has shifted, accounting for things like honor, shame, respect, when respect is due, hierarchies in communication, and which hierarchies apply to you and which don't. Communication isn't just getting things from one place to another, it is this whole expressive form of social discourse. And like, can you be better or worse at communication? Yeah, you can. Like, competence in communication is basically defined by how well and how fluidly you participate in communication rituals and how fluidly you participate in that community. Communication is just this like inherent social act that involves being part of social rituals, pre-established norms, customs, and norms you just can't wish away, unfortunately. And like, one of my earliest breakthroughs in figuring out why I was having issues was when I was a child reading psychology books to figure out why I was so weird because I didn't know what autism was at the time. I read about what communication is and communication theory, and it talked about communication theory being norming, averaging, anticipating, and deciding actions based on a set of constrained game theory parameters mediated by culture. And I was like, wow, that's an amazing way to describe what communication actually is. Honestly, that should have been a sign I was autistic. I don't know how we missed it. Um, but but they eventually caught it when I was 16. But I read this and I was like, yes, this is what communication actually is. It is this weird thing. And so a lot of times in the double empathy problem and the social model of disability, we pretend that communication is something other than that. When scientists are saying autistic people have communication deficits, they're looking at all these factors and saying that we seem to not be able to fluidly participate in these things intuitively. And that if we do figure out how to participate in these things, it's often not a spontaneous intuitive process, but a sort of manual process of figuring these things out and then building structures to compensate for these difficulties. So when Simon Baron Cohen is saying autistic people have theory of mind deficits, what he's saying is that the vast majority of people have this cognitive capacity to mentally model other people and to figure out what's going on inside their head, and then use that information to participate in social communication. And often what they're saying is most people communicate on like 10 different channels. Like, I think of communication like radio waves, and most people are communicating on like 10 different channels, and autistic people are often communicating on like 3. And you could easily make the argument, okay, that's just a difference. That's not a deficit. But also it's perfectly valid to say this is both a difference and a deficit, because most people have this ability to communicate on 10 channels, and some of us aren't. Some of us are still only on 3. And so by these metrics, like I think autistic people sort of straight up do have communication deficits, because we can't participate in all these things very fluidly, and we often fail to participate in these things fluidly. And even amongst other autistic people fail to communicate fluidly. And one of the big reasons that autistic people have success is that we are far more willing and far more quick to provide accommodation. And like I used to be a really big believer in the double empathy problem. I used to think that the double empathy problem was just a straight up reality and could be proved. And so like I mentioned in a previous episode, I was working with autism researchers who wanted me to p hack my data, and the work was specifically on the double empathy problem. In one of those cases, the research was basically looking at representative autistic communities online and representative non-autistic communities, and what it was trying to do is validate essentially what those two other studies were doing, like validate information diffusion throughout communities, and using sentiment analysis and a lot of like natural language processing techniques and mass data collection, which is like literally what I do for my research. It's what I'm really good at, which is why I was asked to help out. It was doing this analysis on autistic groups, homogenous autistic groups, and mixed autistic, non-autistic groups, and then groups with very low rates of autism in them. And then basically just looking at, do these people have frequent communication issues? Are these people good at modeling each other's mental states? Like, do they understand why people are acting the way they are? Do they seem to be able to understand all these things? And it turns out autistic people are pretty consistently bad at communicating with each other, and like consistently confused with each other in ways that clearly show miscommunication and often like blow up in their faces. If you've ever been in autistic communities, you know exactly what I'm talking about. This is a super common thing. And what we found is that the rates of miscommunication, depending on the community, were like 1.5 to 4 times more likely in autistic communities than representative non-autistic communities. And that's why they wanted to like p hack the results, because they're like, ooh, this is not turning out the way that we want it to. So let's reform the data, or let's remove these chunks of data so that we can show more statistically significant results. In this case, the goal was to show results that would show that there are no significant differences, but the reality was there were. And a fun fact is the only places where there weren't were places in which there were extremely restrictive communication norms, where like rules were explicitly enforced and you had to communicate along certain guidelines. It's like when I built my Discord, one of the things that I had in mind was all this research that I had done on autistic discords and autistic forums, and just being like, okay, let's not replicate these mistakes. And so I'm going to think a lot more about how I enforce things and rules and things like that are going to be good, and then sort of allow the community to naturally develop and then form rules and norms around those. And yeah, basically turns out autistic people not great at understanding and communicating with each other, with one exception, and that is in groups where they are purely self-selected, and purely self-selected in very niche categories. So, for example, my Discord would be a good example of an autistic community in which the communication difficulties are not nearly as present and not nearly as obvious as you would in a non-autistic community. But that is because it's a bunch of people who listen to my podcast and like my podcast and all wanted to join the podcast community. That is a massive selection bias, right? Like there are only certain people who will make it through that sieve. But yeah, even then though, we have lots of times where people don't understand each other and need to ask clarification and need to be like, what are you talking about? It happens very frequently. It's fine. It's not a big deal that it's happening, but interacting with lots of autistic people, as I do all the time, I'm like, yeah, these people are kind of not great at communicating things. And that's, I don't know, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with us kind of just being bad at some stuff and good at others. But a lot of autistic people, like the problem that I had mentioned with the double empathy problem, is that it was based on vibes from Milton, who probably most of the autistic people that they probably know are going to be other autistic people in their field, other autistic people working in their university department, other autistic people in and around them, other autistic people that they sort of self-select into knowing. And like I really wanted to validate the double empathy problem, but I just straight up couldn't. And I've tried many times, and every single time I've tried it, it's like autistic people often just really do struggle with communication, which I guess is what you would expect. And at the end of the day, I'm just like, this is fine. Who cares if autistic people have communication deficits? Why is that a bad thing? Why do we need to pretend like we don't? Why don't we just accept, yeah, just kind of not great at this one thing, but it's fine because that isn't what actually matters about you. And like the things that the double empathy problem fails to consider, like what I talked about before, just that people with ASD 2 and 3 have very clear and obvious communication deficits, and there's really no good reason to suspect that people with ASD 1 don't also have communication deficits given other symptom parallels and continuums on the autism spectrum. Or like how autistic people are actually really good at communicating. So this is another like data analysis thing that I've done. Autistic people are actually really good at communicating with other non-autistic people if they share the same background and education. In fact, the best predictor of whether or not you'll be able to fluidly communicate with someone isn't if they are autistic or not autistic. It's if they share the same background, education, and training as you. So if you're a autistic computer engineer, you are probably going to be much better at communicating with other non-autistic computer engineers who work in your field than you will be autistic people who work in sociology. And people who share the same political persuasions much better or much easier to communicate with each other than people who don't share the same political persuasions. It turns out autism is not the mediating factor in good communication. Lots of autistic people are successfully able to communicate with lots of non-autistic people if they share backgrounds. Also, if they share personality traits or if they share interests and things like that. And like another thing is the double empathy problem doesn't account for compensation strategies. And just not accounting for what if these compensation strategies work really, really well with other autistic people, and you both have a deficit and can communicate well with other autistic people. What if that's just what's going on? What if that is the best way to describe why some autistic people really like other autistic people, and that autistic people in general tend to prefer each other? What if it's because we've developed the same compensation strategies? And those compensation strategies just happen to align really well with each other. And that might also explain why some autistic people don't do well with other autistic people, is because they've developed very different compensation strategies, and those compensation strategies are incompatible. What if they have deficits, and so because of those deficits, they make up for it in a certain way, and it just so happens they're making up for it in the same way as another person, and that makes it easy for them to communicate. Another really big assumption in a lot of double empathy problem research is that it assumes that people with communication deficits will not clearly communicate with other people who have communication deficits. And I think this is a bad assumption. I think that the assumption that there is going to be positive interference, like bad communication, will stack on top of other bad communication to make sort of communication doubly bad. I think that's a bad assumption. Like two people being bad at communicating might not actually make communication twice as worse. A really good example of this is so foreign military exchanges, when we would go on exercise with other people in other militaries, a lot of times people who were not native English speakers were better at communicating in English with other people who weren't native English speakers because they both spoke bad English in the same way, and they were better able to understand each other than like fluent English speakers were able to understand. And I think if you, that's just like an example, but if you have communication deficits, if two people have communication deficits or empathy deficits, and those deficits are in the same place, it can actually make communication easier. So imagine if most people are communicating on 10 different frequencies or like 10 different radio channels, and you can only receive three of those. Versus if you can only transmit on three channels and the other person you're talking to can only receive on three channels. Who do you think is going to be more fluid in communicating? Probably the ones that are only communicating on the three channels and not the one that's communicating on 10 to someone who can only receive three. So in this case, communication deficits and empathizing deficits would actually make communication more smooth. And like maybe that's what's going on as well. Who knows? All these things, like this is highly speculative, but these just simply aren't addressed in the double empathy problem. And like another thing, what if autistic people still have communication deficits, but are far more willing to be charitable to each other because they know what it's like to have communication deficits. And so they're willing to put a lot of things aside and overlook things because they know that they've been in that same place before. I do this all the time. So I spend all my free time talking to autistic people. I frequently meet people who have way more obvious signs and symptoms of autism than me. It's way less masked, it's way more presentable. And I basically extend infinite amounts of charity towards them. And they will often talk to me and be like, I have no idea how to express how nice this has been talking to you. And I think the reason that happens is because they're in a society that's so used to them never having charity extended to them. And then they meet a guy who's like extremely hyper charitable. And like, what if that's actually the double empathy problem? What if the double empathy problem is actually that autistic people are way more likely to give another autistic person the benefit of the doubt? A really common phenomenon that has happened in my life a lot, and I know it happens in other autistic people's lives because they've told me about it, is they will be like really frustrated with someone and not able to communicate with them, and then all of a sudden something snaps and they're like, oh, I think that person might have autism, and I've been communicating with them like they're not someone with autism, and now I'm just going to extend charity to them that I wouldn't have extended charity to them before. And then communication gets a lot better. It's a very frequent thing that happens with me and my wife. When my wife will meet someone and will be having trouble talking with them, and I'll go, wait, you're describing someone who has autism, and she'll go, wait a second, oh, that makes sense, and then just rejig and rechange the way she communicates with them. And it's like, okay, again, is this because that person doesn't have communication deficits? or is it just because there are social compensation structures that are being put in place? Like, I think it's both. Like, it is both. And I think another way to explain why autistic people report such high levels of satisfaction and saying, like, I really like other autistic people, I really like spending time with other autistic people. I mean, that's me for sure. Autistic people are my favorite people to spend time with. It, like, but I also recognize that the types of autistic people that I hang out with are highly selected and highly curated to be my type of autistic people. I also know, just because of all this research that I do, that there are large groups of autistic people that I really don't like. And I really don't like hanging out with, and I really don't like spending time with. And if I had to hang out with them all the time, I'd be like, no, actually, I don't like hanging out with autistic people. But I hang out with my people. I hang out with my autists. And most autistic people hang out with their autists and are blissfully unaware of all the different types of incompatible autisms that exist within the autism spectrum. And so they'll report, I like and get along with other autistic people way better than non autistic people. And it's like, have you considered it's just because you're meeting you clones? Like, have you considered that it's just like you're just meeting a bunch of people like you who have shared values and shared ways of thinking about things? And it's not necessarily that they're autistic, but they're a really specific type of autistic. And like, autistic people, by the way, just I have found this really bad at predicting what other autistic people are like unless I'm asking them about autistic people from their own groups. So one of the things I do during surveys and in interviews is I ask them to predict where other autistic people will be on their questions, or where do you think most autistic people will answer? And pretty much consistently across the board, autistic people think that other autistic people will answer like them. And I mean, I personally find that funny. And it's like, damn, Simon Baron Cohen got our asses again. But like, it is, I don't know, fairly indicative that when autistic people are saying that they can fluidly communicate with other autistic people, it's because the other autistic people are highly selected and in a very specific group. And so, what are we supposed to do with this information? And I mean, I'll be honest. I think autistic people have communication deficits, and the double empathy problem describes a real phenomenon. I love autistic people. I deeply care about autistic people. I want to help autistic people. I spend all my time trying to do that. And I I think that there's a sort of implicit assumption in a lot of proponents of the double empathy problem who think that saying you have a communication deficit is stigmatizing and it's bad. Like, you will find that over and over and over. Saying deficit is stigmatizing. And I just don't agree. Like, why can't autistic people just be bad at things? Like, seriously, who cares? Who cares if we actually do have communication deficits? I mean, I say this, and like, I know that as I'm saying this, I'm like really hardcore Imago Dei pilled, and most proponents of the double empathy problem aren't. But like, I know a lot of disabled people. I know a lot of autistic people. I know a lot of people who struggle with autism a lot more than I do. And none of that makes me think less of them. I know people who have cognitive disabilities different from my own. I know people with intellectual disabilities. I know people with physical disabilities. Saying that those people have deficits does not make me think less of them. And I think if you think less of them because they have a deficit, you are a bad person. Because, like, I mean, as part of being Imago Dei pilled, like, I think that all people, regardless of capacity, regardless of ability, are all just as valuable as everyone else. And in this world, there are people who are weak. There are people who are weaker than everyone else. There are people who are weak because they were born with congenital defects. there are people who were born ill. There are people who have lifelong chronic illnesses that seriously affect them. There are people with cognitive and physical disabilities. That does not make them worse as people. There is no amount of status, strength, or power that will have any change on how important or how meaningful you are. This is one of the things that I am constantly pushing back against about bad autism theology that looks at autistic people, see a deficit, and say, oh, that means these people are separate or in some case worse. I think that's where people like Eleanor Stump go completely off the rails. I think that's where people like Andrew Pinsent, who coined the term spiritual autism, go off the rails. It's because they are tying cognitive capacities to what it means to be made in the image of God. And I think that's wrong. And I've collected so much data. I talk with so many autistic people, and like I have done a lot of self-testing. I have enrolled for tons of studies, and straight up, I will say I have cognitive deficits. I don't know how else to say it. I was really self-hating about this for a while. I was in denial about it because I had a chip on my shoulder about how I'd always conceptualized myself as smart and hyper competent, and here I was doing all these studies that made me feel like a massive idiot. But eventually I just got over it. I got over it because I was like, actually, so what? Who cares if part of my brain doesn't work like everyone else's? Who cares if I'm sort of just worse at these tasks than other people? Not me. Like, a lot of the double empathy problem seems to insist on or like assert a world in which inequality only exists because of social constructs and forces. And at least when it comes to autism, I don't think that's really an accurate assessment of reality. Like, a lot of the double empathy problem and the social model of disability more broadly seem to be really insistent on breaking away from stigma caused by disability, but in their attempt to break away from stigma, they end up reifying it by taking a massive leap and saying that if basically stigma exists, and stigma exists because people have been mislabeled as having deficits. It's like, okay, but what if they weren't mislabeled? Like screaming, I don't have a deficit, and claiming that I have a deficit or claiming that autistic people have deficits causes stigma is, I think, a fairly problematic thing to say. Because it's like, all right, but what if you do have a deficit? Does that mean stigma's justified? The problem is that deficits are stigmatized in our society. But the solution isn't to deny that a deficit exists. The solution is to say deficits shouldn't be stigmatized, but to say the people of this world that have been labeled weak are still just as valuable as everyone else. Like, I hate to get Corinthians pilled on you guys, but like that's essentially where I'm coming from. Where I like, if you say saying someone has deficits is stigmatizing, what do you do with people who have ASD2 and ASD3 when you can clearly see they have a deficit? When they can't talk? Do you say, okay, that stigma's deserved? Or is it like, no, the issue is that we are making moral judgments on people based on their abilities and capacities, not that saying a person doesn't have a capacity all of a sudden speaks something bad into existence. It's fine acknowledging that some people are just worse than others at certain tasks. When you deny that you have a deficit and say, I don't have a deficit, and it's wrong to say that I do, what is that saying about people who can't deny that they have deficits? I'm not trying to cast aspersions on these people. And I know they would say, well, that's not at all what we're trying to do. But like denying that you have deficits and insisting that saying you have deficits is bad is straight up just a way of trying to distance yourself from people who can't deny that they have deficits. And I I think the strategy is to just deny that having deficits is bad, to push back and say, actually, it's fine to have deficits. It's fine to just be bad at things. Now, people will bring up examples like women were thought to have deficits previously, or racial minorities were thought to have deficits, or gay people were thought to have deficits. And they don't. They just, they're different, and we live in a patriarchal or racist society or whatever. And it's like, cool, but those things aren't autism. Those things aren't analogous to autism. Those things don't work like autism. These are very different categories. And I mean, we don't have time to go into this, but like, autism is very different from race, and it's very different from gender. Like, I've already been talking for too long, but like, just to wrap it up, the double empathy problem is a useful social construct. I use it all the time. It is very good. It is very good at describing a specific type of sociological phenomena, and I would encourage people to continue using it because it works to explain asymmetries in communication and how autistic people don't, or how autistic people often aren't met halfway. We're expected to go 100% of the way, and everyone is just supposed to not do anything to accommodate us. The double empathy problem is pointing out, no, actually, we should both meet halfway. And that is a really useful thing. I just think the double empathy problem, when it's used to try to disprove deficits, fails. It doesn't disprove deficits. It does explain complex social phenomena and inherent asymmetrical communication asymmetries and barriers placed on autistic people who are trying to participate in social communities, but it isn't showing that we don't have deficits. As far as I can tell, from all the best data I've been able to pull up, autistic people probably do have communication deficits. And you know what? That's fine. That's cool. You aren't a worse person. You aren't less of a person. Not having the same cognitive capacities as another person doesn't make you any less valuable or less of a human. And we should just say that. Anyway, that's all I have to say for this podcast. I've been John. Thank you for listening to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum. If you would like to contact me, you can contact me at christianityonthespectrum@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter at ChristianityOn. You can find me on Blue Sky at christianityon.bluesky.social. If you would like to join our Discord, send me an email. I'll send you a link. That is all for now. Bye.